My hands were in pie dough when my phone started buzzing against the kitchen counter, and I almost didn't look. Flour up to my wrists, radio playing low. A Tuesday afternoon in October that felt like every other Tuesday afternoon of the last 8 years. That's the thing nobody tells you about the worst moments of your life. Most of them don't announce themselves. They arrive in the middle of something ordinary, wearing the same clothes as every boring hour that came before them, and you don't even wipe your hands before you pick up the phone that's about to change everything. My name is Carol Ashby. I'm 61 years old, and for 32 years I worked as a billing coordinator at Riverside Memorial Hospital, which is a polite way of saying I spent 3 decades reading the fine print that insurance companies hoped people wouldn't read, catching the discrepancies nobody else noticed, and learning the hard way over and over that the person who actually understands a document is the person who holds the power in the room, whether anyone else in that room realizes it or not. I've lived in my daughter Megan's house for 8 years now. Not as a guest. Not exactly as a resident either if you ask my son-in-law, though he'd never say that part out loud, not back then. I had my own room off the kitchen, the one that used to be a mudroom before we converted it, and every morning I made coffee for whoever wandered downstairs first, and most days that was my granddaughter Lily, 7 years old and already sharper than half the adults I know, closely followed by her little brother Sam, who at 5 believed I invented the concept of pancakes. I want to tell you what that Tuesday looked like before the phone buzzed because I think you need to understand what I thought my life was so you'll understand what it felt like when I found out what it actually was. The dough was for a pie I didn't even need to make. Megan's dental office was doing a bake sale for a coworker going through chemo, and I'd volunteered without being asked, the way I volunteered for most things in that house, quietly before anyone had to ask twice. My husband Walter used to say I had a compulsive need to be useful, and he meant it as a compliment back when he was alive to say things like that. Walter died 3 years before we're picking up this story. Heart attack in the garage, wrench still in his hand, 41 years of marriage ending on a Saturday morning while I was inside making eggs I didn't know he'd never eat. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That grief belongs to a different part of this story. I mention it now only because it's the reason I sold my house and moved in with Megan and Trent in the first place, and because grief, I've learned, doesn't just take people from you. Sometimes it takes your judgment too for a while. It makes you grateful for things you shouldn't have to be grateful for. The phone buzzed again. Then again. That particular rhythm, 3 fast buzzes, a pause, then a fourth, belonged to the Ashby-Dolan family and friends group chat. The one Megan had created years ago to coordinate Thanksgivings and birthday parties, and more recently, the 4th of July reunion we'd been planning for months. 41 people in that chat. Aunts, cousins, Trent's college roommate who'd somehow never been removed, my son Danny out in Denver, Trent's mother Diane, who posted more than anyone and read less than anyone. I kept the chat muted most days. I checked it in the evenings the way you check the weather, not because you expect anything to change your plans, just because it's habit. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked anyway. The most recent message was from Trent. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, which is the thing about group chats. Nothing ever is until it's addressed to everyone. He'd meant to send it somewhere else. I understood that within about 4 seconds, the way you understand a car is about to hit you a half second before it does, that strange lag between seeing and knowing. Also, can we please stop pretending the old burden situation isn't getting worse? She's in my house every single day of my life, 6 years past when this was supposed to be temporary, and nobody in this family wants to have the actual conversation about what we do when she can't take care of herself anymore. I'm not the bad guy for saying it. Someone has to. I read it twice standing in my own kitchen, the kitchen I paid for, though I didn't let myself think that thought yet, not fully, not in that first minute, with flour still ghosted along my forearm and my granddaughter's math homework spread out on the table where I'd been helping her with fractions 20 minutes earlier. The old burden situation. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that exact moment because it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even hurt, not the sharp kind. It was something quieter and stranger. A kind of falling like a floor you didn't know was there, giving out beneath a house you thought was solid. I set the phone down on the counter very gently, the way you'd set down something you were afraid might go off if you dropped it. And then I stood there for a long moment, looking at my own hands, at the flour, at the pie crust going soft under the plastic wrap, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, given how much the rest of me was shaking, he doesn't know I never left that chat. That was the first thought. Not how could he? Not how dare he? Just that small, cold procedural observation, The kind I used to have at work when I found a coding error that had been quietly overbilling a patient for 11 months. He'd forgotten I was in there. Which meant this wasn't a message meant for me to see, ever. Which meant it was truer than anything he'd ever said to my face. The second thought came about 10 seconds later, and it was worse. He thinks the house is his to be tired of me in. I didn't say either thought out loud. Lily was in the next room, humming to herself over her homework, and some part of me, the part that had spent 8 years keeping this family's peace like it was my last remaining job, was already calculating how to keep my face from telling her anything was wrong. I picked the phone back up. I read the message a third time, and then very deliberately I did not respond. I took a screenshot instead. I didn't fully understand yet why I did that. It would be 3 more weeks before I understood exactly how much that single automatic instinct, the instinct of a woman who spent 32 years learning that documentation is the only thing that survives a dispute, was going to matter. But I did it anyway, the way you sometimes do the right thing before you know why it's right. And then I put the phone face down on the counter and finished rolling out the pie crust with hands that had gone very suddenly very cold. Trent noticed his mistake 9 minutes later. I know because I watched it happen in real time. The little Trent deleted a message notification appearing where his words had been. A small gray ghost where the wound had opened. He never said anything to the chat. He never said anything to me. For the rest of that day and the day after and the day after that he was, if anything, slightly warmer than usual. Asked me how my knee was doing. Complimented the pie, which I'd finished and sent to the bake sale without tasting a single bite of it myself. I let him think I hadn't seen it. That was, I think now, the first real decision I made in this whole story, not the biggest one, not the bravest one, but the first, and it came from somewhere old in me, some deep-worn groove that had been carved out over decades of choosing not to make a scene. I told myself I was being smart, gathering myself, deciding what to do before I did anything. I didn't tell myself the truer thing, which was that some part of me was still hoping, even then, even holding the screenshot, that there was a version of this where it didn't mean what I already knew it meant. I want to stop here because I know some of you are already nodding. If you've ever found out what someone really thinks of you by accident, through a text sent to the wrong thread, a voicemail that didn't hang up all the way, a conversation you weren't supposed to overhear, you know there's a particular kind of grief in it that's different from being told to your face. Being told to your face, you can argue. Being found out by accident, you just have to sit with the knowledge that it was always true, and you were simply the last to know. That night, after the kids were in bed, I lay in the room that used to be a mudroom, in the house where my name sat quietly on a piece of paper nobody in that family had thought about in years, and I thought about my late husband's voice, the way he used to say, "You don't have to prove you belong somewhere, Carol, you just belong or you don't." I thought I'd belonged. I was about to spend the next several weeks finding out exactly how much of that belonging had ever been real, and exactly how much I was about to have to prove. Here is what our life actually looked like in the version I believed in before that Tuesday mornings that started at 6, because Sam still climbed into bed with someone most nights and someone was usually me. Coffee made by 7. Lily's lunch packed with the crusts cut off, not because she asked anymore but because I still did it. Some habit from Megan's own childhood that had migrated forward a generation without anyone deciding it should. Trent left for work at 8:15 in whichever leased vehicle he was driving that year. He traded up every 18 months or so, something about how it looks pulling into a client's lot. And Megan left for the dental office at 9, and from 9 until 3:30 the house and the children were, in every practical sense, mine. I want you to understand that I didn't experience this as a burden. I experienced it most days as the best use of the years I had left. Walter and I never had grandchildren of our own generation to spoil, not the way some of our friends did. We'd had Megan and Danny late, and by the time grandbabies came along, Walter was already 3 years in the ground. So there was something in raising these two, in the daily texture of Fraction's homework and skinned knees and Sam's insistence on wearing his Halloween costume for weeks after Halloween had ended, that felt less like an obligation and more like a second chance I hadn't expected to get. But I want to be honest with you about the parts one didn't examine closely enough, because if I don't tell you those parts, you won't understand how something so wrong sat undisturbed in a house for 8 years. The first thing I didn't examine was money. When I sold my house after Walter died, the house we'd raised our children in, the house with his workshop still smelling of sawdust 11 months after he stopped using it, I put $148,000 of the proceeds into Megan and Trent's mortgage, cutting their principal nearly in half in a single afternoon at a title office that smelled like burnt coffee. It wasn't a loan. Nobody used that word. It was, as Trent put it at the time, "You basically becoming part of this house, Carol," which is exactly right because you're part of this family. My lawyer, Marcus Alvarez, an old friend of Walter's from his law school days who'd been handling our family's paperwork since before Megan was born, had one conversation with me before I signed anything. Just one. He sat across his desk with his readers pushed up on his forehead and said, "Carol, I'm not going to tell you not to do this. But if you're putting 6 figures into a house you don't own, I want your name on that deed. Not a verbal agreement about being part of the family. Verbal agreements about family don't hold up when families change. And families always change. I didn't want to make it a legal transaction. That's the truth. It felt cold, transactional, like I was measuring out love in percentage points. But Marcus was patient with me, and stubborn in the specific way lawyers who've known you for 30 years get to be. And eventually I agreed to a quitclaim deed adding my name alongside Megan's and Trent's. A small, quiet, unremarkable piece of paper that got filed at the county recorder's office and then, as far as I know, was never mentioned again by anyone in that house for 8 years. Not by Trent. Not even really by me. That's the first thing I didn't examine. I let a document do the work that a conversation should have done. I told myself the paper was a formality, a favor to an old friend's caution, and that the real agreement, the one that mattered, was the unspoken one, the family one, the one where I was simply part of things. I want you to remember that piece of paper. It's going to matter more than anything else in this story. And for 8 years I treated it like it didn't matter at all. The second thing I didn't examine was Trent himself, and I think this is the part that's harder for me to say out loud even now. Trent Dolan is, I still don't know what tense to use for a man I see every week at custody exchanges, a commercial leasing agent, the kind who talks in square footage and asset class, and refers to his own life the way you describe a property listing. He drove nice trucks he couldn't quite afford outright. He wore a watch that cost more than Walter's entire pickup, bought, I'd later learn, on a store credit card he was still paying off 2 years later. He was, by every surface measure, successful: client dinners, LinkedIn posts about closing another deal, a corner office he photographed more often than he sat in it. And underneath all of that, in ways I saw clearly only in retrospect, he was a man who had built his entire identity out of appearing like someone who didn't need help from anyone, especially not from his wife's mother, especially not in the specific, humiliating to him arithmetic of she owns part of the roof over my head. I noticed things. Of course I noticed things. There's a particular tightness that comes into a man's voice when his mother-in-law hands him a check for the property taxes because the escrow account came up short again. A tightness that isn't gratitude, even when the words coming out of his mouth are technically words of gratitude. I noticed how he introduced me to new colleagues at the one work party I ever attended. "This is Carol, Megan's mom, she helps out with the kids," which was true and also managed to erase, in 6 words, $148,000 and a deed and 8 years of packed lunches. I noticed, and I filed it away the same way I used to file away small coding errors at work that didn't seem worth flagging yet, not because they weren't real, but because I was waiting to see if they added up to a pattern before I made anyone uncomfortable by pointing them out. That was my blind spot, if I'm being honest with you, the way I've promised to be. I had spent so many years being the person who held things together, smoothing arguments before they became fights, absorbing small disrespects so they wouldn't calcify into large ones, that I had genuinely lost the ability to tell the difference between keeping the peace and slowly disappearing. There was a particular Tuesday, maybe 4 months before the group chat message, when Trent came home late from a closing that had apparently gone well, loose-tied and loud with the specific energy of a man who's just made a commission he wanted someone to be impressed by. Megan was in the shower. The kids were already down. And Trent stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me finish the dishes he and Megan had left in the sink, and said, not unkindly, in the tone of someone making conversation rather than making a point, "You know, Carol, it's kind of amazing you're still doing all this at your age. I keep telling Megan we really lucked out. At your age." I was 59 at the time. I said thank you because that's what I always said, and I finished the dishes and I didn't think about the sentence again until much later, until it came back to me whole and sharp in the middle of a different night entirely, and I finally heard what it had actually meant. Not gratitude. Surprise. The specific surprise of a man who had never quite metabolized that the woman doing his dishes and holding a piece of his mortgage was a person with an expiration date attached to her usefulness, in his mind, and that he was already quietly wondering what happened after that date arrived. I didn't know it then. This is something I only understood clearly much later, once I'd heard it in his own words, but Trent had started around that same time, having a very different conversation than the one he had with me, one that took place almost entirely in his head and occasionally carefully with his mother. I remember standing in my kitchen, my own house technically, though I never let myself use that word, thinking. He called it helping out. Like I was a service he'd hired, and forgotten to thank properly, instead of a person he'd promised in every unspoken way to actually see. That's the closest I can come to telling you what those months felt like from the inside. Something was off. I could feel the shape of it without being able to name it. A low, constant hum of being simultaneously essential and invisible, needed every single day and acknowledged almost never. I dismissed it the way you dismiss a strange sound in your car's engine when the car is still technically running. I told myself he's stressed about work. He's not built for gratitude, some people aren't. Megan loves you. The kids love you. That's what matters. I want to stop here for just a moment. Because if you've ever kept a household running while quietly wondering whether anyone would notice if you stopped, the meals, the school pickups, the small invisible architecture that holds a family together, you already know exactly what those months felt like. You don't need me to describe the specific ache of being indispensable and unseen at the same time. Some of you have been living inside that ache for years. I was too. I just didn't have a name for it yet. By the time autumn came around again, by the time that phone buzzed on the kitchen counter with flour on my hands, the hum had been running under everything for months. I just hadn't let myself turn up the volume enough to hear it clearly. That was about to change. The days after I saw the message were strange in a way I still find hard to describe. I went through the motions of my life exactly as before. The coffee, the lunches, the fractions, homework, but underneath every ordinary interaction I was watching. Not obviously. I'd spent 3 decades learning how to review a document without letting the person across the desk know exactly which line I was circling in my head, and I put that skill to a use it was never designed for. I watched how Trent talked about the house. I noticed for the first time in 8 years that he never once said our house when he meant the actual structure and the actual mortgage. He said my house when he was annoyed about something in it, and our house only when he meant himself and Megan, a pronoun that had apparently, somewhere along the way, quietly excluded me from its definition without anyone bothering to inform me of the change. I watched his mother too. Diane Dolan had never much liked me, in the specific, well-mannered way some women dislike each other without ever once raising their voice about it. She was a real estate broker herself, sharp about property values in the way some people are sharp about celebrity gossip, and she'd made a habit over the years of referring to my contribution to the house, when she referenced it at all, as Carol's little arrangement, a phrase that managed to diminish $148,000 and assign deed down to the scale of a coupon. Later, she told me things about that period I wish I'd known at the time. How many dinners at her house had included some version of the conversation? What's the actual plan with your mother-in-law long-term? How she'd been the one, 2 years earlier, who'd first used the word temporary out loud in front of Trent, plainly, deliberately, the way you plant a seed you intend to come back and water. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew what I could observe with my own eyes, and what I observed that October was a woman who watched me hand Lily her lunch each morning with an expression I can only describe as someone doing math. The first real crack came about 2 weeks after the group chat message, on a Sunday when the whole family had gathered for Sam's birthday, Diane included, Trent's brother Curtis and his wife included. 20-some people crowded into a backyard that Megan and I had spent all Saturday decorating. I was refilling the drinks table when I overheard Trent and Diane near the fence line, half hidden by the grill's smoke, in the particular hushed register people use when they think no one nearby speaks their language. Still hasn't said anything about it, which honestly worries me more than if she had. Trent was saying. She probably didn't see it, Diane said. You know how she is with that phone, she barely. She saw it. I know she saw it. I checked the read receipts the next morning. I want to tell you exactly what happened in my body in that moment, because it's the kind of thing you feel before you understand it. My hands, which had been steady around a pitcher of lemonade, went very still. Not shaking, the opposite of shaking, a kind of held stillness like a held breath. He knew. He'd known for 2 weeks that I'd seen it, and he had spent those 2 weeks smiling at me, thanking me for the pie, asking about my knee, performing exactly the same warmth he'd always performed, except now I understood it wasn't warmth at all. It was containment. He wasn't being kind to me. He was managing me, the way you manage a problem you're hoping will resolve itself quietly if you just keep smiling at it long enough. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have stopped pretending to. Two people standing 8 feet apart at a child's birthday party, both performing a version of normal we both knew was already broken. And neither of us saying so because saying so would have meant admitting the party, the family, the whole 8 years, wasn't the thing we'd both told ourselves it was. I didn't confront him that day. I finished refilling the drinks table. I sang happy birthday to my grandson with everyone else, and I meant every word of it, because loving those children had never once been the part of my life I doubted. But something had shifted, and it kept shifting in small increments over the following weeks. There was a Tuesday when I overheard, through the thin wall between the kitchen and the garage, Trent on the phone, not to Diane this time but to someone else, a voice I didn't recognize, maybe Curtis, maybe a friend from work. I mean, at some point you have to have the conversation, right? Like, what's the actual exit here? I can't just wait for. And then the garage door had closed, cutting off whatever the end of that sentence was going to be. And I stood in my kitchen holding a colander of green beans, cold water running over my hands longer than it needed to, thinking, the exit. He's talking about an exit. Like I'm a lease he's trying to figure out how to break. There was a Thursday when Lily, 7 years old and entirely without malice, asked me at the dinner table, apropos of absolutely nothing, "Grandma, are you gonna live with us forever, or is that not a thing that happens?" And Trent's fork had stopped moving for exactly 1 second before he said, too brightly, "Of course Grandma's not going anywhere, sweetheart, eat your broccoli." And I watched Megan's face go carefully, deliberately blank in a way that told me she'd had a version of that question asked of her too, somewhere I hadn't been in the room for. I started noticing his hands. This is a strange detail to fixate on, I know, but I'd spent 3 decades reading people across a desk, and hands tell you things faces have learned to hide. Trent had started a habit sometime that fall of touching the back of his neck whenever the subject of the house came up. Property taxes, a leaking gutter, anything. A quick, almost involuntary rub, there and gone, like he was checking for something that wasn't there anymore. I noticed he'd stopped correcting people who assumed he and Megan owned the house outright, when for years he used to make a point in a certain kind of company of mentioning we got some help from family. A phrase he'd once used almost proudly, like it proved how close we all were, and which had quietly, sometime in the last year, disappeared from his vocabulary entirely. I didn't put it together yet, not fully. But something inside me had already started keeping a different kind of ledger than the one I'd kept for 8 years. I wasn't tracking who needed what anymore. I was tracking what was true. The turning point, the moment suspicion stopped being a feeling and started becoming a decision, came on a rainy Wednesday in early November, 3 weeks after the group chat message, when I drove myself downtown, ostensibly to pick up a prescription, and instead sat in my car outside Marcus Alvarez's office for 11 minutes before I made myself go inside. Marcus was 71 now, mostly retired, taking on only the clients he'd known for decades, of which I was one of the last. He looked older than he had at Walter's funeral, softer around the middle, but his eyes were exactly the same, sharp, patient, the eyes of a man who'd spent a career listening for what people weren't saying. "Carol," he said, when his assistant showed me in. "This isn't a checkup visit, is it?" "No," I said. "I need you to pull the file." "The house. Megan and Trent's house." He didn't ask me why, not right away. He just nodded, the way he'd nodded 30 years earlier when Walter and I had come in to draft our first will, both of us 29 and terrified of what it meant to plan for our own deaths. He pulled the file himself instead of having his assistant do it, and he laid the deed out on the desk between us, the same document I'd signed 8 years earlier in a title office that smelled like burnt coffee, my signature there beside Megan's and Trent's, 3 names, equal footing, unremarkable and enormous all at once. "It's all still exactly as we set it up," Marcus said, running a finger down the page. "Tenants in common equal thirds. Nobody's amended anything. Nobody's asked to." He looked up at me over his readers. "Why does it feel like you're asking me this because something's wrong? And not because you're curious?" I told him about the message. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not Megan, not Ruth, not Danny. And hearing myself say it out loud, in that quiet office with the rain going sideways against the window, made it real in a way that reading it alone in my kitchen hadn't quite managed to. Marcus listened without interrupting, which is a rare enough gift in a person that I've never stopped being grateful for it in him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, And then he said the thing that changed the shape of everything that came after. Carol, I want you to understand something, and I want you to really hear it, not just nod at it the way you nod at things you've decided not to act on. He tapped the deed. This piece of paper means he doesn't own that house without you. Not morally, legally. If it ever came to a sale, a refinance, anything, your name has to be on every document. He cannot remove you from that house's ownership without your signature. Whatever conversation he's having with his mother about an exit, he doesn't have one. Not unless you give him one. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the rain kept coming down, and I thought about 8 years of dishes and packed lunches and a man rubbing the back of his neck every time property taxes came up. And I thought about a phrase I hadn't let myself think yet, not fully, not until that exact second in that office. He doesn't know what he doesn't own. Don't tell them, I said finally. Not Megan, not anyone. Not yet. You don't have to decide anything today, Marcus said gently. But whatever you decide it knowing you're not as powerless in this as they think you are. I drove home in the rain with the radio off, and for the first time in 8 years, I let myself feel something I hadn't let myself feel since Walter died. The strange, cold, clarifying weight of actually knowing where I stood. If you've ever been the person everyone counts on but no one accounts for, stay with me. Because what I found in the weeks that followed changed everything, and not in the way I expected it to. I didn't set out at first to build a case. That's not how it felt from the inside. It felt more like I'd simply stopped closing my eyes to things I've been closing my eyes to for years, and once you stop doing that, you can't really choose what you see next. The first thing I noticed once I was actually paying attention was the mail. I'd handled the household mail for years, another one of those small invisible jobs nobody assigns you. You just start doing it and 8 years later it's yours. Sorting bills onto the counter, junk into recycling, birthday cards onto the fridge. In late November, a letter came from the bank, addressed to Megan and Trent, marked in that particular red-bordered way that banks reserve for things they want you to actually open. I set it on the counter as I always did. But that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink and looked at it for a long time before I made myself pick it back up. I didn't open it. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me that you understand I didn't cross that particular line, not that night. But I did notice the bank's name on the envelope, and it wasn't the bank that held our original mortgage. It was a different institution entirely, one I recognized from a billboard on the highway, the kind that specializes in home equity lines of credit for people who need cash fast and don't ask too many questions about the terms. I mentioned it to Megan the next morning carefully, the way you mention something you're testing the temperature of. There was a letter from a bank yesterday, sweetheart. Didn't recognize the name. Everything okay with the mortgage? Megan's face did something complicated. Oh, that's probably Trent's business thing. He's been looking at some kind of loan for the leasing office, expanding the client entertainment budget or something. I don't really get into the finances, honestly. He handles most of that. She handles the children. He handles the money. I'd known that division existed for years and never once questioned whether it was a fair one. I let it go that morning. But 3 days later, walking past the home office Trent kept in the converted half of the garage, I saw, not snooped, saw the door was open, paper spread across the desk in the specific chaos of a man who'd stopped bothering to hide something because he assumed no one was looking. A printed application for a home equity line of credit. $85,000 requested. The address on the application was our address. The applicant listed was Trent Dolan, sole applicant. I stood in that doorway longer than I should have. Because here is the thing Marcus had told me weeks earlier, sitting across his desk with the rain coming down. He cannot do anything with that house's equity without your signature. Which meant either Trent didn't understand that was applying for a loan against equity that legally required my consent to access, or he did understand it and was hoping somehow to find a way around it. Or around me. I remember standing very still in that doorway, feeling something that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to disbelief, the specific, dizzying disbelief of realizing someone has been quietly making plans about your life without once including you in the planning. I didn't take anything. I didn't photograph it, not that day. I want to be honest that I came close to walking away entirely, telling myself I was imagining the significance of it, that there was probably some innocent explanation, some version of events where this wasn't what it looked like. That's the thing about a lifetime of choosing peace over truth. The instinct doesn't disappear just because you've decided intellectually to stop indulging it. It fights you. It offers you an exit ramp at every single turn, dressed up as reasonableness, as not jumping to conclusions, as maybe you're wrong, Carol, maybe you're the problem here, maybe you're the one being paranoid. I called Danny that night instead. My son picked up on the second ring, the particular ring pattern I use only when something's actually wrong, a code we developed without ever discussing it, the way siblings and mothers sometimes do. Mom, what happened? I told him everything, the group chat message, the conversation I'd overheard at Sam's birthday, the letter, the application on Trent's desk. Danny was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, long enough that I asked if he was still there. I'm here, he said. And then in a voice I didn't recognize from my own son, careful, guilty. The voice of someone who's been carrying something heavy for a while and is deciding in real time whether to finally put it down, he said. Mom, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you months ago, and I'm sorry. This is something I didn't know then. This is something Danny told me much later, once we were sitting across from each other at my kitchen table with the whole truth finally on the surface between us, and I'm telling it to you now the way he told it to me, because you deserve to understand what my own son had been carrying, even though I didn't know it yet myself that night on the phone. Danny had been in the family group chat the entire time, same as I had, same as everyone had. He'd seen Trent's message the same day it went up, minutes after it went up, before Trent even deleted it. And he'd seen something else too, something I hadn't seen, a separate thread, a smaller chat, just Trent and Curtis and two of Trent's old college friends, one of whom had, months earlier, mistakenly added Danny to a group text meant for something else entirely and never removed him, an accident nobody had ever noticed or corrected. Danny had been sitting silently, invisibly, inside a conversation where Trent had been talking about the mother-in-law situation, for the better part of a year, complaining, joking, at one point speculating out loud about what happens to the house math if she ever needs like real care. Is that on us? Is that even our problem? Danny hadn't told me. Not because he didn't love me. I never doubted that, not for 1 second, not even in the moment I learned what he'd been sitting on, but because, as he put it that night on the phone, voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, I kept telling myself it wasn't my business to bring into your life, Mom. I kept telling myself you'd figure it out on your own, and if I said something it would just blow everything up and maybe it would resolve itself, and I don't know. I think I just didn't want to be the one who broke it. So I let you find out some other way. And I hate that I did that. I sat with that for a long moment on the phone in my kitchen, in the house where my son had just confirmed my worst suspicion by confessing his own complicity in it. I felt many things in that moment, but the clearest one, the one that surprised me most, wasn't anger at Danny. It was recognition. Because hadn't I done the exact same thing for years with smaller things? Hadn't I watched Trent's small disrespects accumulate and told myself every single time that saying something would blow everything up, that it would resolve itself, that keeping quiet was its own kind of love? I understood, in that moment, something that felt bigger than the specific betrayal of the phone call. I understood that an entire family can build itself, generation after generation, around the shared belief that silence is the same thing as peace. It isn't. It never was. It's just delay wearing peace's clothes. I need you to send me screenshots, I told Danny. Everything. Whatever you have. He did that same night. A long scroll of messages I read alone at my kitchen table at 11:40 at night, tea gone cold beside me, each one landing like a small, precise stone. Trent, months earlier. At some point somebody's gotta have the actual conversation about a facility, right? Like a memory care place or whatever, before it gets to be an emergency. Trent, more recently. The equity thing would solve a lot honestly if I can get it moving before anyone asks too many questions. Curtis, unhelpfully egging him on. Just do it, man, who's gonna stop you? Who's gonna stop you? I read that sentence 4 times. And somewhere around the 4th reading, sitting alone in a kitchen I had helped pay for, in a house where my granddaughter's fraction homework was still sitting on the counter from earlier that afternoon, the last soft edge of my hesitation finally, completely, gave way. I photographed everything. I organized it, old habits, 32 years of learning that the person with the clearest documentation wins the dispute, into a folder on my laptop labeled, with a bluntness that almost made me laugh out loud alone at midnight, house. I had the group chat screenshot. I had Danny's screenshots. I had the recollection of the overheard conversation at Sam's birthday, dated and noted, the way I used to note discrepancies at work before I brought them to a supervisor. I did not tell Megan yet. That was the hardest part. Sitting across from my daughter at breakfast the next morning, watching her cut Sam's pancake into smaller pieces, knowing what I now knew about the man she'd married, and saying nothing. I told myself I was protecting her, gathering enough proof to make the truth undeniable before I forced her to confront a version of her husband she might not be ready to see. That was partly true. But there was another part of me, quieter and more honest, that knew I was also protecting the plan, because once I told Megan, this stopped being something I controlled and became something the whole family had opinions about, and I had learned very recently and very expensively exactly how much family opinion could cost a woman who trusted it too easily. I called Marcus back 2 days later. "I need you to draw something up," I told him. "And I need you to tell me exactly what happens if I ask for a buyout of my share, instead of just sitting on it." "Now we're talking," Marcus said, and for the first time since Walter's funeral, I heard something in his voice that sounded almost like pride. The confrontation happened on a Sunday 3 weeks before Christmas, at a family dinner Diane had insisted on hosting to get ahead of the holiday chaos. 12 people around her long dining table, china out, the specific performance of togetherness that Dolan family gatherings had always specialized in. I told Megan the truth 4 days earlier. I want to tell you honestly that it was one of the hardest conversations of my life, harder in some ways than the confrontation itself, because it meant watching my daughter's face rearrange itself around a version of her marriage she hadn't let herself see. She cried. She asked me at one point in a small voice I hadn't heard from her since she was young, "Did you know this whole time and just not tell me?" And I had to explain as gently as I could that knowing and knowing are two different things, and that some truths a person has to arrive at in their own time, on their own evidence, or they don't fully believe them at all. By the time we sat down at Diane's table that Sunday, Megan knew everything. Danny had flown in from Denver 2 days earlier, ostensibly for an early Christmas visit, though everyone at that table except Trent understood the real reason he was there. Marcus had the paperwork ready, a formal notice of my ownership interest, a demand for accounting on the Helic application Trent had filed without my knowledge or consent, and quietly an offer. Either the family bought out my third of the house at fair value within 90 days, or I would exercise my legal right to force a partition sale of the entire property. Trent believed, walking into that dinner, that he had the room. He'd arranged, without quite realizing he was arranging it, exactly the kind of audience he was most comfortable performing for. His mother at the head of the table, his brother across from him, a captive dinner party crowd that had, for years, absorbed his jokes and his complaints and his version of events without much pushback. He'd spent all week slightly warmer than usual toward me, the way he always got when guilt was gnawing at some unexamined corner of him, complimenting a casserole, asking about my knee. He had no idea what was coming. I waited until the plates were mostly cleared. I didn't raise my voice. I had rehearsed, in the days leading up to that dinner, exactly what I wanted to say. Marcus had helped me refine it, the two of us sitting at his office late one evening going over language the way you'd go over a legal brief, because I understood by then that the words themselves were going to matter as much as the truth behind them. I had my folder with me. I had not brought it out yet. "I want to say something," I said, "and I'd like everyone to let me finish before anyone responds." The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses correctly that something is about to happen that it can't undo. Trent's hand, I noticed, went briefly to the back of his neck. About 8 weeks ago I found out, by accident, the way you find out most things people don't intend for you to know, that Trent has been describing me, to this family and to his friends, as an old burden. As a temporary situation that's gone on 6 years too long. As a problem that needs an exit strategy. I kept my voice level. Somewhere in my chest something was shaking, but I had promised myself in Marcus's office that whatever cracked in me during this conversation, it would not be my composure, not first. I also found out that 3 weeks ago, Trent filed an application for an $85,000 home equity line of credit against this house. Without telling Megan. Without telling me. Diane's face had gone the particular pale of someone doing rapid math about how much of this she'd known, and how much of it was about to become visible that she'd known. Trent's mouth opened. "Carol, that's not." I said I'd like to finish. I did not raise my voice when I said it, and something about the steadiness of that, I think, is what actually stopped him, not the volume, the absence of it. "I want to be very clear about something because I don't think you've ever fully understood it, and I think that's actually the root of everything that's happened. 8 years ago, I put $148,000 into this house. Not as a gift. Not as helping out. As an equal owner with my name on the deed, alongside yours and Megan's. Equal thirds. That means, Trent, that you cannot take a loan against this house's equity without my signature. It means you cannot sell this house without my signature. It means, in every legal sense that actually matters, this was never entirely your house to be tired of me in. I reached into my bag then and set the folder on the table. Not thrown, not dramatic, just set down the way you'd set down a document at the end of a long, careful presentation. This is a copy of the deed. This is the HELOC application with your signature and only your signature, which the bank should not have accepted without co-owner consent, and which I have already flagged with them formally. This is a notice from my attorney requesting either a buyout of my ownership share at fair market value within 90 days, or I will file for a partition action, which, for anyone at this table who doesn't know what that means, forces the sale of the entire property and splits the proceeds by ownership share, regardless of anyone's preference. The silence after that lasted, by my count, almost 11 full seconds. I know because I counted them the way you count seconds after a firework goes off, waiting to see whether the sound was the whole event or just the beginning of it. Trent's first response was not what I expected, and it was also, in its way, exactly what I should have expected given 8 years of watching how he handled being caught at anything. "This is insane," he said, and his voice had gone hard in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "You're going to blow up this entire family over a text message that got sent to the wrong thread? You're going to force us to sell our kids' home because you got your feelings hurt." He looked around the table, gathering the room the way he always did, reaching for the audience he was used to having. "This is exactly the kind of thing I was talking about. This need to be the center of every single." "Trent." Megan's voice cut through his quiet, but with something in it I'd never heard from my daughter before. A flatness, almost, the sound of a woman who has run out of a particular kind of patience for good. "I read the messages. I read all of them. Curtis's too. Don't do this in front of me like I don't already know." I watched something in Trent's face falter. Not break yet, just falter. A man realizing the audience he'd counted on had already quietly changed its mind about him before he'd said a single word in his own defense. "Megan, that stuff online, that's not. You know how group chats are, people vent, it doesn't mean. You filed a loan application against our house without telling me," Megan said. "That's not venting, Trent. That's a decision. You made a decision about our family's finances and you didn't include me in it, and I genuinely don't understand how you thought that was okay." Diane, who had been silent for nearly a full minute, a personal record by my estimation, for a woman who rarely let 30 seconds pass without contributing something, finally spoke, and what came out of her was not what I expected either. "Carol, surely we can handle this like adults without lawyers and, this is a family matter, not a courtroom." "It became a legal matter," I said. "The moment your son tried to borrow $85,000 against equity he doesn't fully own, without my consent, and without telling his wife. I didn't make it a legal matter, Diane. I'm simply the only person at this table who understood, this whole time, that it already was one." Trent's composure, which had held for the entirety of the confrontation up to that point through pure aggression, finally cracked. Not into confession, not yet, but into something colder and more defensive. A man backed into a corner reaching for the only tool he had left. "You know what this actually is?" he said, and his voice had dropped, gone tight and low in a way that was somehow worse than the shouting would have been. "This is you punishing me for years of feeling like I had to walk on eggshells in my own house because you were always there, always helpful, always making sure everybody knew how much you were sacrificing. You want to talk about what people didn't understand? I have spent 8 years feeling like a guest in a house I pay the mortgage on, and now I find out I don't even fully own it, and somehow I'm the villain for being tired of that." It was, I'll admit, the first true thing he'd said all night. Not an excuse for the loan, not an excuse for the message, but a real, if distorted, glimpse of the fear that had apparently been living under all of it. I didn't answer it right away. I let it sit in the room for a moment because I understood, even in the heat of that dinner table, that there was something underneath his anger that was going to matter more than his anger itself, something I wasn't going to get the full shape of that night. "I hear that you felt that way," I said finally, and I meant it. I did hear it, even as I refused to let it undo a single thing I just laid on the table. But feeling crowded in your own home doesn't give you the right to secretly try to take equity that isn't only yours. Those are two separate problems, Trent, and you've spent this whole conversation trying to make the second one disappear inside the first one. He didn't have an answer for that. He pushed his chair back from the table, not storming out exactly but close to it, muttering something about needing air, and Curtis, of all people, was the one who broke the silence that followed, looking at his brother's empty chair with an expression I hadn't expected from him. Something between disappointment and recognition, a man realizing he'd spent a year egging on something he was only now understanding the real cost of. "For what it's worth," Curtis said quietly, to no one in particular, "I told him he shouldn't do the loan thing without you two talking about it first. I should have said more than I did." Diane said nothing at all for the rest of the dinner. It would be another 2 days before her position in all of this fully revealed itself, but I noticed, even that night, the particular way she avoided my eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the recalculating stillness of a woman realizing the ground she'd been standing on for a long time had just shifted underneath her too. I drove home that night with Megan and the kids, Trent having taken his own truck and not come with us, and somewhere around the halfway point in the dark with Sam asleep in his car seat and Lily quietly working through something on her tablet, Megan reached over and took my hand off the steering wheel for just a second, just long enough to squeeze it once, hard, and let it go. "I'm sorry," she said. "For all of it. For not seeing it sooner." "You saw what you were allowed to see," I told her. "That's not the same thing as not seeing." I didn't know it yet, but the hardest part of that conversation, the part where Trent finally said, out loud, everything he'd been unable to say at a dinner table full of witnesses, was still 3 weeks away. Trent didn't come home that night or the next. He stayed with Curtis, according to Megan, sleeping on a pull-out couch in a spare room while lawyers on both sides, his hastily retained and Marcus unhurried and precise, began the slow work of untangling 8 years of assumed togetherness into a fair and finalized arrangement. The full reckoning, when it finally came, didn't happen at a dinner table in front of an audience. It happened on a Thursday evening in January in Megan and Trent's kitchen, just the two of them and me at Trent's own request, a request that surprised all three of us, I think, given how the December dinner had ended. I almost didn't go. Megan asked me to be there, and I hesitated because some part of me had already started imagining a version of my life on the other side of this that didn't require me to sit across a table from Trent Dolan ever again if I didn't want to. But I went because Megan asked and because I understood this even as I was deciding some part of me still wanted after everything to understand the shape of what had actually happened to us. Trent looked different that night. Thinner, somehow, in the way people get thin from a particular kind of stress that isn't about food. He didn't perform for us. That was the first thing I noticed. No confidence, no leasing agent charm, none of the smooth talk he usually wrapped around anything uncomfortable. "I want to tell you something," he said, looking mostly at the table, "and I need you to just let me get through it, because if you interrupt me I don't know if I'll finish." I said nothing. Megan said nothing. He took a breath and started, and once he started, the words came out in a way that felt less like a performance and more like something finally being let go of after being held too tightly for too long. "It started small. I want you to know that because I think if I'd known where it was going I would have stopped it a long time before I did. It wasn't the house at first. It wasn't even really about you, Carol, not in the beginning. It was, I remember the exact night it started, actually. It was maybe 2 years after you moved in. I came home from a bad quarter, a really bad one, missed my numbers 3 months running, and I walked into a kitchen that was completely handled without me. Dinner made, kids fed, homework done, and I stood in the doorway and felt like I wasn't necessary. Like the house would run exactly the same with or without me in it. And the only thing that made me feel like I mattered in my own home was being the one who paid for it. And then I found out I wasn't even fully the one who paid for it. You were. And something about that it lodged in me. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. That's the first lie. I told myself I was being ungrateful, that you'd done something generous and I was being small about it, and I buried it, and I told myself that was the end of it. He stopped for a moment, hands flat on the table, and Megan reached over without a word and put her hand over one of them, not forgiving him yet, I think, just steadying him enough to keep going. It wasn't the end of it. It came back every time something made me feel small, a bad month at work, my mom saying something about how well Curtis was doing, whatever it was. And every time it came back, I let myself say something a little worse about it to somebody. First just to my mom, venting the way people vent. then to Curtis. Then in that stupid group text with the guys where everything feels like it doesn't count because it's not real life, it's just typing. I told myself that wasn't the same as saying it to your face. I told myself as long as I kept being nice to you, kept complimenting the pies and asking about your knee, the other thing didn't matter because actions were what counted, not words. I actually believed that. For a long time, I actually believed the version of myself that smiled at you every morning was more true than the version writing those messages at night. This is what he told me finally in his own words on a Thursday in January, and I'm giving it to you now the way he gave it to us because whatever else Trent Dolan is, and whatever this story cost me, I don't think it's fair to erase the fact that some real, ugly human fear was underneath all of it. That doesn't undo what he did. But it explains it, and I think there's a difference between the two that matters. The loan, he said, and his voice cracks slightly here, the first real crack of the night. I want to be honest about that too because it's the worst part and I don't want to soften it. I knew somewhere that I probably needed your signature. I told myself I didn't know for sure, that maybe the bank would just process it, that maybe it was a gray area, that maybe I could get the money moving fast enough that by the time anyone asked questions it would already be done and it wouldn't matter how it started. I was drowning at work. I'd made some bad bets on a couple of deals that didn't close, and I didn't want anyone to know how bad it had gotten, especially not you, Carol, because God, this is humiliating to say out loud because some part of me thought if you knew I was struggling financially, it would confirm every unspoken thing I was afraid you already thought about me. That I wasn't really the man of this house. That you were the one actually holding it up. He looked up, finally, at both of us, and there was something in his face I'd never seen from him before. Not guilt exactly, guilt had been there at the dinner table too, dressed up as anger. This was closer to something like grief. I was trying to fix a problem I was too proud to admit I had, by taking money out of a house that isn't only mine, from a person I'd been quietly resenting for 8 years for saving all of us. I don't have a way to make that sound better than it is. I know how it sounds. It's exactly as bad as it sounds. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. I want to tell you that I felt some great wave of forgiveness in that silence, some cinematic softening, but that isn't the truth, and I promised you the truth. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated, recognition mostly. Recognition of a man who had spent years being afraid of something so ordinary, so common, so utterly survivable, that he had let it curdle into something that nearly cost him his marriage and his family's trust rather than simply saying it out loud to the people who loved him. You could have just told me you were struggling, I said finally. At any point in 8 years. I would not have made you feel small for it. I know what struggling looks like, Trent. I buried my husband 3 years ago with a wrench still in his hand. I know exactly what it costs to pretend you're fine when you're not. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one. The consequences, once they came the way consequences usually do. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, in a series of unglamorous concrete facts. Trent did not lose the house outright. That was never really the point, and it isn't the point of stories like this one most of the time. What he lost was the illusion he'd built his identity around, the illusion of a man fully, independently in command of his own household, unaided, unindebted, needing no one. The buyout Marcus negotiated on my behalf converted my ownership share into a structured payment plan, modest monthly amounts over 10 years rather than a lump sum that would have forced a sale none of us actually wanted, and Trent, humbled and to his credit, more careful than he'd ever been about money, took on a second listing territory at work specifically to cover it, a fact Megan told me was something that sounded, cautiously, like the beginning of respect returning. Diane's position cost her more than she expected. Whatever careful neutrality she tried to maintain in the weeks after that dinner evaporated the day Megan finally confronted her directly about the temporary comment made 2 years earlier. The seed Diane had planted long before any of us knew it was growing. Diane didn't deny it. She simply said coldly that she'd only ever wanted what was practical for her son, a sentence that told Megan, more clearly than any argument could have, exactly where her mother-in-law's loyalties had always actually lived. Megan didn't cut her off entirely. Family rarely allows for such clean endings, but something closed between them that Diane, I suspect, still hasn't fully recovered from and likely never will. As for me, I moved out eventually 6 months later into a small condominium 15 minutes away, purchased partly with the first installment of the buyout and partly with money I'd been quietly saving without even admitting to myself that I was saving it for exactly this. I still see the children 3 or 4 times a week. I still make Lily's lunches on the mornings I pick her up for school, crusts cut off out of habit more than necessity now, because some habits outlive the reasons you started them and become simply love in a different shape. Trent and I are civil. Careful, still, in the specific way people are careful with each other after something has broken and been reset but never fully healed. He thanked me once awkwardly at Sam's birthday party the following spring for not blowing everything up more than I deserved, which is, I think, as close as Trent Dolan is capable of coming to a real apology, and I decided that day to let it be enough. I think about that group chat sometimes, 41 people, most of whom never knew, most of whom still don't, exactly what one accidental misdirected message set into motion. I think about how close I came in that first cold moment at the kitchen counter, to simply letting it go, to telling myself I'd misread it, to choosing one more time the particular piece that had cost me so much for so long. I didn't choose that, in the end. And I think that's the real story here, not the mortgage, not the loan, not even the message itself. It's the 8 years before it, the years I spent believing that being needed was the same thing as being valued, until one accidental sentence, meant for other eyes, finally showed me the difference. There's a particular kind of love that mistakes usefulness for belonging, and I think that's the real subject of everything that happened in that house. I didn't lose my place in that family because Trent stopped needing me. He needed me every single day, in every practical sense, right up until the night he finally told the truth about it at his own kitchen table. I lost my place because needing someone and valuing them turned out to be two entirely different currencies, and for 8 years I'd let myself be paid in the wrong one without ever checking the exchange rate. What strikes me now, looking back, is how ordinary the warning signs were. A man rubbing the back of his neck. A pronoun quietly narrowing from our house to my house. A comment about your age delivered as praise that landed years later as an expiration date. None of these were dramatic. None of them on their own would have justified the reaction I eventually had. That's precisely why they worked as camouflage for so long, because betrayal in a family rarely announces itself as betrayal. It arrives disguised as small talk, as jokes in a group chat, as a loan application left open on a desk that no one thinks to close because no one thinks anyone's still watching closely enough to see it. I think, too, about what Trent said that Thursday night, that he buried his fear about not being necessary, until it curdled into resentment he couldn't name even to himself, let alone to me. I don't think that excuses what he did, but I do think it explains something larger than his story alone. How many families are quietly organized around unspoken hierarchies of who is allowed to need help and who is only allowed to give it, and how much damage accumulates in the silence between those two roles before anyone finally says the true thing out loud. The document on that title office desk 8 years earlier turned out to matter more than any conversation we ever had about love, gratitude, or family. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it's the truth this story arrived at, and I've stopped pretending otherwise. Sometimes the clearest expression of how much you're valued isn't a feeling at all. It's whether your name is actually on the paper. Which brings me to something I haven't quite said yet, even to myself until just now telling you all of this. I think the hardest part of this whole story isn't the message or the loan, or even the dinner where I finally said everything out loud. It's the 8 quiet years before any of it, where I told myself that being tireless was the same thing as being loved, and never once stopped to check. If you've ever poured yourself into a family and quietly wondered, late at night, whether you'd still belong there the day you stopped being useful, I don't have an easy answer for you. I only have what I learned. That the people who truly value you will tell you so in ways that don't require you to overhear it by accident. And that it is never too late, at 61 or 71 or any age at all, to ask the plain, unglamorous question of whether your name is actually on the paper, in the family, and on the deed. If there's someone in your own life who let you find out the hard way what they really thought, I'd like to hear about it, just one word in the comments. And to whoever's listened this far with me tonight, thank you for sitting with a story that took me a long time to be able to tell without my voice shaking.